Hi, good evening, and welcome to this public meeting of the Police Practice Group. I'm Julie Shedd from the Carter School for Peace and Conflict Resolution at George Mason, and I'm really privileged to have had the opportunity to support this process. Over the past 6 months, this group has worked tirelessly, and tonight they're going to get to present their recommendations from each of the 4 subcommittees to the county manager. Before we get started, I want to take a minute to acknowledge each member of the committee, and they're on your screen. Allison Carpenter, Cecily Whitfield, David Fitzgerald, Devanshi Patel, Elizabeth Jones Valderrama, Kathleen McSweeney, Kent Carter, Kim Phillip, Latasha Chamberlain, Matt Puia, Naomi Verdugo, Rodney Turner, Saul Reyes, Scott Wanek, and Whitney Kernoodle. The county manager asked the committee to initially focus on 4 areas of work. The first was the Civilian Review Board. What type and what approach do we want to take for the civilian review? The second was the role of the police department in providing mental health services. Third was the role for the police department in traffic enforcement. And our fourth was the opportunity for alternative dispute resolution, including restorative justice and mediation. At the same time as our police practices group of Arlington County residents has been working on these 4 topics, there's Marcia Thompson, who's an expert on law enforcement, has been actively working on an external assessment of policies in 6 key areas. That review has been of the use of force, training and supervision, body-worn cameras, recruitment and retention, internal affairs, and data and statistics. We anticipate that this external assessment will be provided to the county in the coming week, and then we'll be able to share it with this PPG group for review and reflection. Since August 2020, this PPG committee has held over 60 full and subcommittee meetings. They've accessed expert presentations and research. They've hosted 5 community learning sessions, 4 stakeholder roundtables, and invited online feedback from our broader community, which yielded hundreds of comments. The session tonight is going to include 4 separate presentations from each of our 4 subcommittee chairs, followed by clarifying questions from County Manager Mark Schwartz. It's my great privilege to turn over the meeting to Mr. Schwartz now.
Thank you very much, Julie, and thank you to each of the committee members and our subcommittee chairs. You know, it seems like a long time ago when we created the committee back in July, when I think I called each of you and said that really needed your help on working through some very tough issues. We wanted to take a look at some of our police practices and not starting from a point where we say that things are bad, but saying that we do some things well, but there's always room for improvement, and try to take a look at the best practices. As Julie mentioned, Marcia Thompson is conducting an external review, and we'll be getting the results on that in the next week. And we asked the PPG group here, the 15 members, to focus on 4 areas, as we've talked about, to talk about potential models for creating a civilian review board, traffic enforcement practice and policies, also to take a look at mental health and its role in policing and alternative approaches to dispute resolution. Now, the work of the PPG is just one element of all the work that the county is doing to try to address issues of racial equity in our community. In September of 2019, the county board adopted an equity resolution, and that resolution talks about a county where everyone is valued, educated, and healthy and safe regardless of their race. And you know, we've spent a lot of time and a lot of energy focusing on it. It's a very, very difficult issue, and we've only begun the effort to try to address the way we, as a community, handle some of the issues around race and some of the systemic issues that are part of our society. Back in the summer, we appointed a chief race and equity officer, Samia Bird, who's working on advancing that framework. And we have, over the fall, had close to 3,000 people share their views on race and equity and perspective through those dialogues. Now, I wanted to thank, as I said, each member of the committee, and a special thanks to the subcommittee chairs, who we've spent a lot of time with. You know, Rodney Turner has done a fantastic job looking at the Civilian Review Board, and has written an incredible document highlighting a number of models out there. Allison Carpenter, who's with our Public Defender's Office, spent a lot of time looking at traffic practices and policies. Naomi Verdugo, who I assume sleeps at some point, but I'm not aware of when, working tirelessly to look at some mental health policies and how that works, how it relates to our police practices. And then finally, Devanshi Patel, who has spent an incredible amount of time looking at alternative dispute resolution. And so they've been diligent. They've been faithful and thoughtful over the past 6 months. And I just got a copy of the report, which is going to be posted. And it's an excellent piece of work. So you've been at it for more than 6 months. I know that you're all looking forward to making your presentations. And so at this point, I'm going to turn it back to Julie, who will introduce Rodney. Back to you, Julie.
Hi, Patty and all. Matt West, also country.
Okay, so Rodney Turner is a financial services attorney and consultant. As a resident of Arlington, he served on a variety of committees focused on issues important to the community. And as Mark said, Rodney chaired the Civilian Review Board subgroup. So Rodney, I will turn it over to you for the recommendations from your group.
Thank you very much, Julie and Mark, for those introductions. And I want to start at the top and make it very clear that the work that we have put forward is a work of a team. And the subcommittee, I want to give them credit at the top of this presentation right now. My fellow subcommittee members are Kent Carter, Kim Phillip, Captain Latasha Chamberlain, and Saul Reyes. Everyone put in a lot of work on this, and I had the pleasure of putting their thoughts to paper and submitting that to you, Mark. And with that, let's go ahead and start. Next slide, please. As was mentioned earlier, the charge that was presented to us was basically to identify what kind of models are out there of civilian oversight and what would work for Arlington. Basically, what type and approach Arlington adopt. We weren't asked to ask whether Arlington should adopt any sort of model. We were just told to look at what type. Our presumption was the decision had been made by the county manager and others that we would adopt some form of civilian oversight. Next slide, please. So our focus was to look at the different models, what kind of authority the civilian oversight body would have, the composition of that civilian oversight body, the role. What sort of role will the civilian oversight body play in the larger context of civilian oversight itself and with the ACPD and in the county, and the training that members of the civilian oversight body would receive. Next slide, please. And so we began our work by looking at the different models that are out there. There is the review-focused model. And very much as that name suggests, that is a model in which a civilian oversight body would review completed investigations that are done by a law enforcement agency. There is also an investigation-focused model. As that name suggests, it focuses on investigations that can be done by the oversight body of complaints against a law enforcement agency. There's also an independent auditor monitor model. And that is a model that typically engages some sort of professional who has some background in law enforcement or investigations or review of law enforcement work to assess how a law enforcement agency is doing its work and also recommends ways it can improve doing its work. And then there's a hybrid model, which basically means it's a combination typically of the three above referenced models. And there are many different variations of these combinations. Next slide, please. So, our recommendation. We are proposing a hybrid model. And when I say hybrid, it's hybrid in as to function and as to its operation. And so our immediate recommendation is that it would be an auditor-monitor model with a civilian-run oversight body. And when I say civilian-run oversight body, I mean a body comprised of members of the Arlington County community. In the short term, which is 1 year plus out, we would hopefully have that recommendation already put in place in the near term, in the immediate space. Short term, operate the model, monitor how it's doing. And in the long term, after having a period to evaluate how it's operating, to make any recommendations as to modifications to the system as needed. Next slide, please. We believe that a well-functioning civilian oversight authority body would need county staff support. And that would likely be someone working with this body on a part-time basis, probably likely a full-time county personnel dedicated to help the oversight body in its functions. We also believe that the auditor monitor would need some support from the county as well. And that auditor monitor, we believe, to start out, would be someone on a contracted basis. We may determine down the road that it needs to be a full-time county employee, but to start out, we would have a contract with some agency or some entity that is qualified to perform the function. And by qualified, I mean having prior experience auditing and monitoring law enforcement agencies and investigating those agencies as well. Next slide, please. And we propose that this civilian oversight body would have investigative and subpoena authority. And in that, we believe that the investigative authority would be used on a limited basis. As I mentioned before, this is a hybrid model, so it's going to have both a combination of function and form. And so we hope that based upon what we see coming through the door, that our civilian oversight body will be doing mostly review of investigations being done by ACPD, the Arlington County Police Department. However, it will have the authority to do its own investigations if necessary. And in determining whether investigations are necessary, it will have the ability to review investigations, and I say it, and clarify that, the auditor monitor will have the ability to review investigations before they are issued to determine if more work needs to be done. With regard to subpoena authority, as many of you may be aware, there is an enabling statute in the Commonwealth that allows for civilian oversight bodies to have subpoena authority. We believe that this body should have that authority, but it's not going to be necessary to hopefully use it at every instance. We recommend that voluntary efforts to obtain information and documents from the police department be used and exhausted before efforts to seek a subpoena are used. Nonetheless, that authority should be granted to this body. Next slide, please. As I mentioned before, this body would have review authority. And so, with regard to what that means, the auditor monitor would be able to review investigative reports that are drafted by ACPD, and it would be assess them for thoroughness and sufficiency, and then it would have the authority to recommend whether further investigation is needed and what kind of steps would be necessary should be taken before that report is issued. Next slide, please. Now, with regard to the composition of this body, we are not highly prescriptive, but we think it should be an odd number, between 7 to 15 members from the Arlington community. We think it should be broadly reflective of the diversity of our community, and that no members of ACPD, current or former, can serve in this body, but that doesn't preclude other law enforcement veterans from serving. In fact, we think it may be helpful. Now, mind you, the limitation would be they could serve but not have voting authority. Any members of the county government who are selected to serve would have to be cleared for potential conflicts of interest, and all members of the body must be residents of Arlington County. Next slide, please. Now, with regard to what the CRB, or the Civilian Oversight Authority, would do, here are the following authorities it would have. It could make binding disciplinary determinations. And when I say binding disciplinary determinations, that's in consultation with the chief of police. And this is as per the authority that's granted by the enabling statute that was passed last year. It could receive complaints from the citizenry to pass on to ACPD and or investigate itself, depending on the determination of what's the best approach to take. It could advise on policies and procedures at ACPD. It could issue public reports, and those reports most likely would come from the auditor monitor, the entity in which the expertise will be housed on police investigations. And it would have the responsibility of engaging with the community. And that will be largely part of the role that the civilian oversight element of this body would serve. Next slide, please. Now, we are aware that any citizens coming into this, many of whom will not have experience in law enforcement, so training will be necessary. As many of you may be aware, Arlington County Police Department runs a well-regarded Citizens Police Academy. We believe a specialized version of that would be necessary for members of this body. Training on use of force, training regarding to mental health, substance abuse, privacy confidentiality training with regard to ACPD records is very important. And obviously, we think parliamentary procedure guidance would be helpful. Next slide, please. And that's it.
Okay. I guess this is my place to ask questions.
Yeah.
Okay. I had a couple of questions. They're really not anything that we've talked about in sort of any detail, because I just did get a copy of the report about a few days ago. So it's my understanding that we have, and I know that you're joined by the other members of the subcommittee, that there were two opinions. There was a majority opinion and a minority opinion, and that there were some differences. There's a lot of things in common, but there were some differences. If I could ask you, Rodney, or other members of the group, to talk about those points where you didn't have unanimous agreement, and what it was that you talked about when you were working through those issues.
Sure. And I will start, and I will not preclude others from joining in from my subcommittee if you wish to join in. So the differences were, and the majority recommendation was that this body have both investigative authority and subpoena power. The minority opinion was that it have neither. And I want to make sure I'm relaying this correctly. And if I've got it wrong, please feel free to chime in, subcommittee members. The thought was, with regard to the majority opinion, it's the authority that's being granted to us. Well, the state enabling statute allows this kind of authority. And we thought it would make sense to enable this body to have it if needed, as opposed to having to go back and seek it later on. Now, having said that, in the recommendation, we say we don't expect that it's going to be doing investigations all the time. And in fact, we anticipate that many times it will be reviewing investigations done by ACPD. Also, with regard to subpoena power, the expectation will be that it will seek voluntary cooperation before it seeks to get a subpoena to obtain documents and information. The counterpoint in the minority opinion was essentially, I think if I'm instilling this correct, give ACPD a chance to show its worth, in the sense of look at our investigations, review them without seeking all this authority to investigate or subpoena authority as well, to determine whether you actually need those authorities. It's not an unreasonable position, and it was the argument in support of that was well made. Nonetheless, our thought was the authority is available to us by statute. Let's go ahead and invest these bodies with that authority, and with the proviso that it will not be the go-to move at the outset. It's sort of a default position. If you need to do the investigation, you can. If you need to get a subpoena, you can. However, we will try to do things without getting a subpoena first, voluntarily, and we will look to reports to assess whether any investigation by the oversight body, or actually by the auditor monitor, is necessary. Sorry for the long-winded answer. Hope that you...
No. That's fine. And if other members of the group had comments, I welcome them. I did have one other question for you. And it may be that other members of the subcommittee want to talk about it. What types of presentations did you get, and did the subcommittee, rather than, I don't think there were any formal findings, make any sort of assessment about the kind of work that is typically done by the police right now on internal affair investigations? I know that we have Marcia Thompson, who we've asked to go and actually do a deeper dive for us, specifically looking into some of the cases. My question isn't whether you looked at the specific cases, but whether you were briefed on the current internal affairs procedure, and whether the group had questions or reached any informal conclusions. I know that wasn't part of the scope, but nevertheless, curious about your thoughts on that.
Sure. And I also want to, once again, welcome any subcommittee members on here to join in, but I'll start. So yes, we did receive a presentation on the current internal affairs, investigation process conducted by by Captain Latasha Chamberlain, one of our subcommittee members. It was an excellent presentation. It came she provided data as well as some detail as to how the process works. One thing she noted is that complaints that come from the citizenry can come in anonymous. They can come in online, and they can come in, I think, in other written forms as well. One concern that these civilian oversight bodies are designed to deal with, though, is to serve as an intermediary for receiving complaints, What you often hear anecdotally is, yeah, I had a complaint, but I was concerned about giving it to the police. Arguably, if you submit it anonymously, that wouldn't be an issue. But questions are, if the investigation is going to be done by the police, how do they maintain that anonymous status? So with regard to having a civilian oversight body that can receive complaints, that was viewed to be a positive, to facilitate more complaints maybe making its way either through the system to ACPD or being looked at by an independent body. Back to your question, though, with regard to the presentation. We didn't have any, aside from the data that was provided by Captain Chamberlain, we didn't have additional data out there about what's missing. We didn't have an ability to sort of gauge what they weren't seeing, what we weren't seeing, what we couldn't see and what they didn't see. But we had anecdotal sort of, I wouldn't call it evidence. You had suggestions that basically some complaints are not making its way through to ACPD. Yeah, I will stop there. I'm not sure if I've answered your question, please.
No, you have. No, I appreciate that. I just wanted to get a sense of what you had looked at. So, I may have more questions. I'm going to encourage everybody to read the report, which has at least two pages worth of citations. I think that people could take several months and just immerse themselves in it. You took 6 months. And again, I want to thank you and all the members of the subcommittee. You looked at every possible model, and I appreciate your recommendation. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Julie.
Great. Thank you. And thanks to all the members of the Civilian Review Board Committee who just did an incredible amount of work to get to these recommendations. That's fantastic. Our next subgroup we're going to hear from is the traffic enforcement subgroup. And that chair is Allie Carpenter. Allie's the Deputy Public Defender in Arlington, where she's been working for 11 years. So I will turn it over to her for the traffic enforcement subgroup.
All right. Thank you, Julie, Mark, and members of my committee. I'd especially like to thank the members of my subcommittee, who are Whitney Kernodle, Kathleen McSweeney, Scott Wanick, and Cicely Whitfield. Our charge as a committee for the traffic enforcement group was to identify potential models for traffic enforcement that might be applicable for Arlington. We spent a lot of time early on talking about our charge and looking at what we should specifically consider for Arlington. Next slide, please. And so we started with two important items. The first is an assumption, which is that traffic stops and enforcement encompass more than just vehicle stops, but also driving, walking, and biking. The second is an assertion, and that is that distracted, impaired, and reckless driving, each on their own, is a public safety concern. Next slide, please. That allowed us to focus our work on three key areas. The first, it was understanding reasons for traffic stops that are done in the county. The second is understanding the demographics related to traffic stops. And the third is exploring alternative enforcement strategies, including engineering and technology. Next slide, please. Tonight, I will highlight our key recommendations. And while I won't read every word written here, I do want to highlight our immediate short-term actions in a couple or several different areas. The first is traffic data. The second is equity and traffic enforcement. The third is traffic enforcement policy. The fourth is the role of engineering and technology in traffic enforcement. And the final one is traffic safety and education. Beginning with traffic data, we as a group, having looked into everything and having met with ACPD on multiple occasions to review data and really to understand what data existed, what data doesn't exist, and that sort of thing. We feel strongly that improving data collection, which includes both the specific items of data as well as the database that those are stored in, as well as regular independent audits of that data, are extremely important. And so you'll see several recommendations around that sort of thing. Once a significant chunk of data has come in, we're recommending that an independent auditor run a review of that data and submit its findings and questions to the county and to the police department at a regular interval, and that the department review and use the data to inform its supervision and policies in the future. So that is more of a forward-looking recommendation, which is that as the data comes in, as it's collected, that someone independently review it, look over it, raise any flags, ask any questions, do any follow-up as the information necessitates through looking at it. Next slide, please. Equity and traffic enforcement. This mostly went toward making sure that our recommendations would be implemented in a way that didn't adversely affect any particular group or really continue to adversely affect groups that are already suffering, for example, lower income groups or something like that. So first, we are suggesting sliding payment scales for traffic enforcement violations. Some of those might have to be on a state basis, but to the extent that local courts and local departments have the ability to set sliding scale based, an income-based sliding scale, we are recommending that that happen. We also wanted, one of the things we looked at that you'll hear more about later in the presentation is the use of automated traffic cameras, including red light cameras, speeding cameras, things like that. And a common perception of citizens is that local governments use these sorts of cameras in order to generate easy income for the county. The data and statistics based on these cameras, both nationally as well as some of the studies that have been done on Arlington cameras, show specifically that traffic safety increases significantly when these cameras are in place. For example, intersections have a significantly lower rate of serious accidents and things like that after cameras are implemented. And so our suggestions are not at all in order to get money for the county. And so one of our suggestions was to use warnings early on so that really to underline the message that this is for safety, hoping that, if the goal is to increase safety at those intersections, hopefully people who get a warning will change their behavior, will still receive the benefits of those cameras and, curbing the behavior, which is the goal, and don't necessarily have to alienate people and our own citizens in the process. Next slide, please. Traffic enforcement policy. This is a broader area that we talked about. And while Marcia, as you'll hear in the future, looked into police policies, we did specifically look at the bias-based policing policy, as well as some other specific policies. And we want the policies really to reflect a commitment to anti-bias in policing, particularly regardless of state law, in order to eliminate pretextual stops. So we're recommending strengthening some of the policies. One particular state law that that was passed during the special legislative session last August, that goes into effect in March, eliminates or seeks to eliminate what we'll call pretextual stops, meaning stops that could be, for example, equipment violations or minor registration violations or things like that. And so regardless of the future of that, even though it's been passed and it's set to be implemented, we're recommending that the counties really hold tight to that policy and seek to eliminate sort of discretionary stops as much as possible. We also talked about alternate enforcement focusing on traffic safety, since that was our assertion that is an issue of concern, and we want the department to continue to focus specifically on traffic safety. So one of the other alternate enforcements we recommended is utilizing unsworn police, in whether it's specifically employees of the police department or employees of other departments, such as the sheriff's office or parking enforcement or things like that, to help assist with traffic issues and other safety issues. For example, we're recommending, maybe we don't need to utilize sworn police officers to do traffic directions or things like that. Obviously, as county residents, we all know about issues relating to scooter congestion, bike safety, pedestrian safety, things that are impeding on the roadway due to improper parking or things like that. And so we're recommending that the county look into using other sorts of enforcement mechanisms to clear up some of those issues and help make the roads safer for everyone. Next slide, please. Traffic engineering and technology. This recommendation really goes to the cameras. One of the interesting things that our group found out is that the Virginia State Legislature actually limits the use of cameras to specifically red light cameras at intersections and speed cameras in construction and school zones. And so what we're recommending is that the county help advocate for an expansion of those restrictions so that cameras could be used more broadly. And then the county employ or contract with a civilian traffic analyst to take a look at traffic safety issues and help make recommendations for technology that can be used in certain locations that would hopefully cut down on traffic violations, specifically looking at areas that tend to have safety-related issues. And then we want to look at traffic studies as well, because before these cameras can be implemented, those things are going to be required. One, to make sure it's effective, to make sure the investment is made in a place where it's useful, and also just to make sure it's spread out evenly around the county and not targeting any one area more so than another. Next slide, please. Traffic enforcement and engagement. This is some general suggestions. we talked about, using things that don't take up a big budget, like signage, portable mobile displays, to help increase awareness for people driving or, even riding on a scooter or a bike or walking, and helping to change behavior. We're recommending that ACPD continue to seek out and recruit a more diverse workforce. And also, just as an overall policy, focus on utilizing traffic stops primarily for traffic safety violations. And those are ones that go to the 3 issues we talked about: impaired driving or distracted driving or reckless driving. And so really focusing the stops on those 3 issues, and not using stops of, I guess, the broad type of stops we talked about, whether vehicle stops or walk-up stops or things like that, to sort of look into other issues other than the actual reason for the stop. Next slide, please. Traffic safety education and training. What we talked about is just some suggestions for ways that the department could do some outreach and education focused on areas of safety that are specifically identified. For example, communities most likely to suffer as a result of pedestrian injuries or things like that. Youth, just, encouraging community events and things like that. That covers our main recommendations. And so I will turn it over to Mark and see what questions he has for our group.
So thank you, Allie, and thank you to everybody who spent all the time working on that. I'm getting some feedback here, so hold on one second. Okay. My first question sort of encompasses a lot of things that you looked at, and is really based on the fact that I had episodic attendance at some of the meetings. You talked a little bit, I think, about things where we might want to try to get some relief from the state legislature. And I'm thinking specifically of, you had talked a little bit about cameras and where those can go. That was number 1. And number 2, something I'm very interested in was this, I don't know if you had any more details on where it was that we had the ability to do sliding scale fines, or whether you had, I know, we had the Commonwealth Attorney participating in some of the conversations, and whether we have any authority to do that, or that's something where we really need to go to get some approval from the state legislature. Could you talk a little bit more about that? Because I'm very interested in that.
Sure. I think that, I think the recommendation that we know that the county could do would be the warning system, implementing warnings. I think the police, of course, are able to do warnings, and so that's opening another issue. But asking police to collect data on when warnings are given and things like that. And I can't remember, that may be something that is done as a result of the Community Policing Act that passed that went into effect last July. But our focus was on safety. And by implementing these cameras and things like that, people are generally concerned about cameras that, that it's not about safety, that it's about revenue. So just focusing on maybe a warning the first time. I think that the sliding scale, unless it's a county-specific issue, is probably going to have to be up to the state legislature. And so that may be an issue of advocacy or something like that. I know that we had done some initial inquiries, but I don't think we got any concrete answers at this point.
And I'm assuming, and maybe other members of the subcommittee want to talk about that, which is that, the goal here is for safety. And so that we don't want to, this situation's come up before in talking about bail and other kinds of fines, that sometimes they have a disproportionate impact on people who can't afford it, and that tends to be people of color. But I don't know if any of the subcommittee group have any further thoughts on that. Don't be shy, Kathleen.
I just wanted to be recognized. Thank you. Well, I think, like everything else, it's a question of balance, right? And as you say, the focus really is safety without disproportionately impacting people who can't afford, to pay a fine. But, we wouldn't be advocating to putting these everywhere. And technology is definitely, I think our report says this very clearly, technology is not the panacea. Technology is not the answer to everything. There are privacy issues that need to be worked out, and there are certainly issues of making sure that we don't do anything that looks like we're targeting any communities in specific communities in Arlington. And so that's why I think the suggestion to get a traffic analyst was also, in tandem with that one, so that we're smart about where we're putting these. It's where it's going to do the most good. It's where we're seeing the most accidents and the loss of life. And that's really, I think, the issue here.
Okay. I had a question, maybe it may be related to the legislation that went into effect. I think you said it was in August. I probably have the dates wrong, but I remember a conversation. We have a question about data, and I know you spent a lot of time, and I really appreciate your focus on data, about how police officers go about collecting data on traffic stops and whether we want our officers in the situation where they have to evaluate the race or ethnicity of those people they're stopping and what kind of information is contained on driver's licenses. Could you talk a little bit about that? Sure.
So there were two main pieces of legislation our group looked at. And what you're talking about is the Community Policing Act. That was enacted basically about a year ago during the regular session and went into effect on July 1st of 2020. And so prior to our group's inception, the police department had a new state mandate to collect certain types of data and do it in a certain type of way. And so what we found is that in looking at the data, data prior to July 1st of 2020 was done individually by each department. There's no requirement to enter the majority of the data that's in a post-July 1st world in a certain way or in a certain system. And so the police department would be looking at what the DMV had required as far as race and ethnicity. Now those questions have been expanded, and so that data, I believe, is going to be reflected on driver's licenses in the future, or at least in the database. And all of just a vast amount of data is going to be collected, but not just collected, also input into a system. And so as our world moves toward a more technological or tech-savvy world, the information that was previously just getting written on carbon copy sheets are actually going to become e-summonses, which is part of police department anyhow, which allows for a lot of that data just to be collected immediately. And so it doesn't require anyone to go through and implement it, and will just be collected. So what we were able to, I guess, take out of the data prior to July 1st is just much more difficult. It requires someone to go in and to pull it and look at it and really calculate that stuff themselves. So the data after that point, we have a limited amount of it, but it will give a lot more information. It's a work in progress as far as the database that's collecting it, the way that it's getting inputted, the e-summon system. But we did make a lot of recommendations regarding that because it's just, when we started to look at these things, we found that it was almost impossible to make a reasonable assessment about what's going on without the data. And when you don't have a starting point, especially when you potentially have access to so much hard data, it's really hard to make recommendations. It's harder for the police force to look at what's happening internally, to make both department-wide assessments as well as individual assessments about officers. For example, if they're able to run this data relatively quickly, they could look and see if there's some sort of like outliers as far as a certain type of traffic stops, a certain person, or things like that. whereas the previous systems really didn't allow for that to be done easily. So, looking and talking to our guest speakers, we learned about a lot of different ways the statistics can be, run, different ways that numbers can be calculated as far as who's getting stopped, and then what percentage of those stops are leading to searches, what percentage of those stops are leading to either a charge, whether a traffic charge or, an arrest or a criminal charge versus a warning. And so really doing some further inquiry into those things. And that's why we recommended an independent auditor to do that. It's not something that we can just have someone run every so often. It needs to be someone who's skilled and who's able to look at those and really think creatively and ask questions when they can't find the answers easily.
So, I want to make sure we get to the other subcommittees. I wanted to thank you for your time. If any of the other members of your subcommittee had any comments, now would be a good time. If not, we can move on to the next group. And so, Allie and I know Kathleen, and I don't remember who else was it, Cicely or whoever else was on the group. You guys did a great job, a lot of things to think through and a lot of excellent suggestions. So I really do appreciate that. And I'll talk a little bit about the end about what are some of the next steps are. So I'm going to turn it back to the master of ceremonies, Julie.
Thanks. And thanks, Allie, for all the work from you and your team on the traffic enforcement piece. Our next group is going to be the mental health and policing presentation, and the chair of this group is Naomi Verdugo. Naomi's a longtime mental health advocate in Arlington, and she co-leads a NAMI family support group. And I know she'll introduce the other members of her group as well. So, Naomi, it is on to you.
Okay. Thank you, Julie, and thanks to the entire police practices group. But I especially want to thank the members of the Mental Health and Policing Subcommittee. Our subcommittee included a social worker, an Arlington police officer, and people who have lived experience. So they know what it's like to have a loved one with mental illness. And have advocated for improved services at the local and state levels. So just introducing Sergeant Matt Puya, Cicely Whitfield, and Dave Fitzgerald. Thank you guys so much. I learned so much from each of you. Next slide.
I'm just having a little technical difficulty right there.
Okay. Well, I can discuss it if you want.
Why don't you go and get started and we'll get this.
That slide is a short one, and it just says our charge was to explore the role of mental health in policing. So our charge was to examine and make recommendations concerning mental health and policing. But as we talked to members of the community, listened to experts in the field, and deliberated, it became clear that we needed to take a broader public health approach to this work. And so we focused on the two areas you see there. The first is responding to people in crisis. And the second is a more proactive effort to prevent individuals from falling into crisis. And here's why we did that. You can think of crisis or a public safety model as a river. You are standing by a river and you see someone has fallen in, and so you reach out and pull them to safety. Then you look and another person is in the river. And you pull them out, and then another. In a public health model, you go upriver to see what is causing them to fall into the river in the first place. So we went to the county manager and asked if we could take a broader approach, not just addressing people in crisis, those people who need to be pulled out of the river, but the entire system. What can be done to keep them from falling into the river in the first place? So our recommendations cover both of those areas. Next slide. Due to time, I'm going to focus tonight on our crisis-related recommendations, but I encourage you and the community to take time to look at all of the recommendations outlined in our subcommittee report. Our crisis recommendations fall into three main categories. The first, whenever possible, shifting response for mental health-related crisis calls from the police to mental health professionals. Sometimes they're referred to as clinicians in these slides. You'll notice we have recommendations about ramping up co-response. Co-response is where a police officer and a mental health professional respond together to crisis calls. But we are recommending that in short order, the county shift from co-response, which they have for a limited number of hours each week right now. So we want them to grow crisis response and then shift to mobile crisis. When we say mobile crisis, we mean that's where mental health professionals respond to the crisis calls whenever it is safe for them to do so. So the first three bullets you see there are about this ramping up co-response and then shifting to a mobile crisis approach. The second category concerns enhancing Arlington's Crisis Intervention Center. That's the last bullet you see there. And the CIC would allow police to drop people off there. People who are in crisis can stay there for up to 23 hours to stabilize instead of dropping them off at jail or at the hospital where they may be turned away or have a long wait for a bed. Instead, they could wait at the CIC for that hospital bed. And family members could also drop off an ill loved one there. Arlington already has this crisis intervention center, but it needs to be staffed so police and the public can use it more frequently, and so it provides more services. So the bottom bullet here, and then on the next slide, please, the top two bullets there are all about the Crisis Intervention Center. So we think beefing up that existing Crisis Intervention Center would improve Arlington's crisis response services. The next three bullets on this page are also refer to co-response and mobile crisis, where we're talking about use of data. That's important. That's bullets 3 and 4 there, to ensure that mental health workers are able to safely respond to crisis calls. So we know they won't be able to respond to all calls. There are some calls that police will need to respond to. But we hope over time, the percentage of calls that mental health professionals can respond to will increase. And then, let's see, next slide, please. The third category of recommendations is to maximize the use of state-funded alternative transportation. So there is a shortage of psychiatric beds in Northern Virginia, in the state, and in the nation. And what that means is when someone who is seriously mentally ill is ordered by a court to the hospital, they often have to be transported to a hospital many hours from our area. And they are transported in handcuffs, and it is the police who do that. But the state has funded alternative transport, and they just launched it in our area. So we'd like to see use of that alternative transport that has specialty vehicles so people don't need to be handcuffed. We'd like to see that ramped up. We also recognize that Arlington's mobile crisis staff may also require some specialty vehicles to do their job. Next slide, please. Now, with this one, we wanted to make sure that people who have reached out to various crisis lines, including 911, for someone experiencing a mental health crisis, get a follow-up call to ensure that the individual who was in crisis has been connected to the services they need. Next slide. A couple more crisis-related recommendations here. The first involves training so that all Arlington police officers who go out on calls are trained in CIT. The second is so the public knows about services like the Crisis Intervention Center and other Arlington services to offer them treatment options and that they know how to access them. Next slide. But because crisis is seldom the first indication of mental illness or substance abuse, we want to help people get effective services that they or their loved one needs before a crisis occurs. We have a series of these proactive recommendations, and they fall into the 6 areas you see listed there. They are detailed in the report and designed to reduce the number of people who fall into crisis. But I'll just give you a few examples. We are recommending that Department of Human Services offer outpatient and residential substance abuse services for teens and adults. We are recommending the development of more housing options for those who are unhoused, to include those who are not eligible for our shelters because they do not have 90 days of documented residence in Arlington. And we are recommending using peers, that's what we call people who are in recovery from mental illness themselves, and they work as role models or mentors for other people who are experiencing mental illness. But we would like to see peers used more widely to build rapport and trust with people in the community who would benefit from treatment so that they will voluntarily participate in treatment services. So I've kind of briefly reviewed, and I hope people will go to the report because we do have a lot of really detailed recommendations. Next slide. Okay, over to Mark Schwartz. I think you have a question.
Oh, Naomi, I'm not going to let you off with just one question.
Okay, go ahead.
And I know I see David and Matt and Cicely here. You heard a lot of presentations from other communities, and we often have heard, I don't know how many times people come to me and talk to me about the CAHOOTS model or other models in other jurisdictions, and doing a lot of reading about different kinds of models. Was there anything specific, any specific theme that you saw in other jurisdictions that really influenced you? I mean, that's not meant, you could have seen more than one thing, but anything that really made a deep impression on you or members of the subcommittee?
Well, I'll start, but then I hope everyone else will chime in. I think we heard a lot of really interesting speakers with a lot of really good ideas. I know the CAHOOTS model, we had a guy from CAHOOTS speak. He was good, and we got a lot of public comment about CAHOOTS. So I'll just say mobile crisis is really, that's what CAHOOTS is. So I think they answer, they're in a community the size of Arlington, and they answer about 2,000 calls a year, I believe, themselves, not involving the police. And they wish they had more CAHOOTS staff, that is, mental health workers, and they wish they had more to go out and work with folks. But I was impressed by them. But I think our mobile crisis that we're recommending is kind of along those lines. So whether they don't use social workers, mainly for cost reasons. They use people who are from the community, who have been trained in de-escalation and the resources that are available. And I could see us down the road using a mix, where we'd have some peers, we'd have some mental health professionals like clinicians, social workers, and we'd have some community people. So I was impressed by Cahoots, but I'm opening it to anybody else because there was probably a lot of stuff you guys were impressed with or were interested in. Okay, nobody's going to say.
Okay, I know. Yeah, I mean, shy was not a word I would ever use to describe your subgroup, but that's okay. One of the other questions I had is, you lay out a lot of priorities, and this is in the report, and I know I'm really going to recommend people go and look at the report. But if you could talk for a minute or two about what your immediate priorities are, because you laid out a lot of things, I think, which have incredible value. And I know we live in a community where everybody is going to want to do all of those things right now. And I think you actually spent a lot of time trying to figure out if you had to pick a few things that would happen first, what those would be. If you could talk about that for a minute.
Okay, over to Dave.
So it's going to be actually nothing's easy, right? So the first hard thing to do is to integrate DHS clinicians with the emergency communication system, right? So Arlington has a very robust ECC. It's all focused on the police, fire, and whoever else uses it. Arlington clinicians have to be integrated with that so that they have a process that police will work with them for to integrate that so that they can actually do co-response on a daily and hourly basis, right? So that'll be the first step. We have a lot of clinicians at DHS who work for emergency services. They're excellent. They have to get out into the field more once that ECC thing has been done. And so you'll look at numbers with co-response starting to trend up immediately to tell you that whether this is working or not. And then the other short-hanging fruit, Mark, is going to be getting the procedures right with the staff right at the CIC, Crisis Intervention Center, so that the police can feel comfortable using that often instead of very infrequently. And I think those will be your first metrics for success. I think they'll make a huge difference.
Okay. One more question, because I know we have another group and interested in all of your thoughts, especially Matt's thought on this. You talk about making sure that 100% of our department gets the crisis intervention training. And I know you spent a lot of time looking at that. And I've heard, from many people that our police officers do a really good job under difficult circumstances. But I'm interested in seeing whether you picked up on any other best practices elsewhere, and how you actually get to 100%, because I know that we've been trying really hard to do that. So there's just a couple of questions wrapped in there, and I don't know if you want to start, Naomi, or ask Matt to comment on it.
Well, I'll just start because Matt schooled me really well. And I know we aren't asking for 100% of Arlington police to be trained in crisis intervention training and team training. And for folks who don't know, that's a lot of de-escalation training. We're asking for those who go out on patrol, who deal with the public, to be CIT trained. So that's a subset. There are other folks in ACPD. So we aren't asking for every last person to be CIT trained, but for those who go out on patrol. But then I'm turning it over to Matt for any other things you'd like to see or anything you want to add to that question.
Yeah, so how that would be accomplished is for years, as recruit officers go through the academy and they complete the field training process, before they are sent forth to work as solo patrol officers, they go through a week-long CIT training course. And because of that process that's been happening for years, that number has grown in terms of the number of officers, percentage-wise, that are CIT certified in patrol into the high 70s to low 80s. As that continues, you're going to see that number continue to increase because officers that may still be in patrol now that didn't go through the CIT training when it was first initiated. They are moving on to other assignments within the police department. They may be retiring. And just through attrition, that number is going to increase from year to year to the point that we can get it ideally into the 90s and close to 100% over the next couple of years. And I think that is definitely important for us as an agency. I think we also need to be looking forward towards some refresher or advanced CIT training for those officers that are interested. But I also want to just make sure that we highlight that is, it's almost just a stopgap measure. So the officers that are responding to those acute situations where there is a propensity for violence, law enforcement is necessary at the scene. The officers have that awareness. They have that understanding, knowledge, training, the ability to de-escalate, interact with these citizens to hopefully promote the most favorable outcome for all involved. That's great in those particular set of circumstances. The vast majority of the circumstances I think that we examined as a group were ones where law enforcement is not needed, and we can use resources that DHS has through current co-response models, ideally models that involve mobile crisis in the future, where we are getting these clinicians to these citizens so we can get them the best possible care at the earliest possible opportunity. That's where we want to live.
Okay. Thanks, Matt. Anything else you wanted to add, Naomi, or we'll be...
Hey, Mark, actually, if I could just add one thing, because we have Cicely, a social worker here, and she and I got on the phone and we talked to, well, all of us heard from Bellevue, Washington, and how they use social work students. We know that there's a shortage of social workers, and they had something kind of interesting, and can I put you on the spot, Cicely, to explain it? Do you hate me?
No, please put her on the spot. I love that.
Not a problem, Naomi. So Bellevue, Washington had a program called, I believe it was Bellevue Cares, and their program really focused on using social work students, interns, to really address phone calls that were not necessarily emergencies, but things people call the police for. They get a lot of senior phone calls, things that seniors need assistance with, things that we don't necessarily think about, but just those kind of check-in kind of wellness calls that occur with their population. And it was one of the things that we found very interesting and also could be very helpful, particularly when we know, that some of those phone calls that we get, some of the phone calls that I've heard in the community have been around things that seniors just couldn't do or could not find anybody else to do. So it was nice to hear of a program that was doing something that was using students for free to go out and do, but also give the students the learned experience of dealing with clients in need in the community.
Great. So thank you very much, Naomi and David and Matt and Cicely. More to come on that. I'm going to turn it back to the boss, Julie Shedd.
It's great. And this group just was such a wealth of experience and knowledge. It was, I learned so much in the mental health meetings. It was incredible. So our last group is the Alternative Dispute Resolution Group, and it was chaired by Devanshi Patel. Devanshi is a private attorney focused on issues affecting young people and families, and is the CEO of the Center for Youth and Family Advocacy. And I am sure she will recognize the rest of our group. And thank you very much, Devanshi, and the Alternative Dispute Resolution Group. You're on.
Thank you, everyone. Good evening. And it is my privilege to be able to recognize the members of the ADR subgroup, Elizabeth Jones, Valderrama, Captain Latasha Chamberlain, and Cicely Whitfield. Thank you so much for all of your work on the ADR subgroup. And thank you, everyone in the PPG and also county staff and all of our presenters who came and spoke with us about matters affecting our charge. So the ADR subcommittee was charged with identifying strategies in lieu of traditional policing and alternatives to and within the criminal legal system. Excluded from the review were areas considered by the other subcommittees, so mental health, traffic, and civilian review board. Next slide, please. The ADR subcommittee recognizes the impact of systemic racism on communities of color, the pernicious effect of systemic racism, and that it remains hidden from our conscious and subconscious. So the ADR, I'm sorry? Julie?
That wasn't me, so go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Okay. The pernicious effect of systemic racism is that it remains hidden from our conscious and our subconscious. The ADR subcommittee believes that the recognition of this truth empowers our community to engage in transformative social change. Accordingly, the subcommittee accepted or approached its charge by considering the full spectrum of involvement in the legal system, from entry to exit. And these are the 3 areas in which we address this particular charge. Next slide, please. First, when looking at entry points into the criminal legal system, the ADR subcommittee evaluated 911 call data to determine how this resource is being used. Unfortunately, we learned that a large number of calls for emergency service are actually civil in nature or are for quote unquote suspicious activity, meaning suspicious person, event, or activity. While many of these calls didn't result in police contact or report, it's important to recognize that police encounters are stressful for all involved and can be traumatic when an encounter feels unjustified or motivated for improper reasons. So the strong emphasis is placed on changing community reliance and the culture of using 911 resources. The ADR subcommittee believes it's necessary for the county to engage in an intentional public-private campaign to address Arlington's culture of calling 911. And this campaign must accomplish 3 main goals. First, it must provide information to the community regarding available resources other than 911. Second, it must create community awareness on the impact of improperly using 911 resources. And third, it must support a strong community policing program that utilizes community-based organizations to bridge the gap in communities where there is a historically based distrust of law enforcement. Next slide, please. Again, looking at the point of entry, the ADR subcommittee recommends that the Emergency Communications Center, its procedure for evaluating and routing calls, be expanded beyond the current binary emergency, non-emergency system. You've heard some of this with Naomi's presentation. The subcommittee recommends that the county implement recommendations of the PPG, so all of the groups, which includes the alternatives provided by traffic enforcement and mental health subcommittees. The ECC dispatcher should have the ability to transfer non-public safety calls to the appropriate agency or service provider so as not to utilize 911 resources. It's also imperative that the 911 dispatchers receive appropriate bias and anti-racism training to evaluate the nature of the calls received by ECC. Next slide, please. Looking at the point of contact, the ADR subcommittee believes it's necessary for all law enforcement to be trained to understand when requests for citizen identification is appropriate. Arlington County Ordinance 17-13C provides the limited and narrow circumstances for when a uniformed officer may request identification in the course of an investigatory stop. Several recent cases have analyzed similar ordinances from localities throughout Virginia, and one of those cases is Harrington versus City of Virginia Beach. In that particular case, it lays out the very narrow public safety element and the requirement regarding when circumstances suggest the immediate potential for injury or damage to a person or property, which would rise to the trigger for 17-13C. The ADR subcommittee recommends that the county ordinance be amended to align with the court's holding in Harrington, and that law enforcement training be consistent with this holding and through an anti-racism lens. Next slide, please. Looking at options before entry into the legal system, the ADR subcommittee believes it's necessary for the county to begin funding and promoting community-based organizations with programs based in conflict resolution. These programs should be made available to resolve matters between law enforcement and aggrieved community members, and specifically for matters that may not rise to the level of a civilian review board. Next slide, please. Every opportunity should be made to utilize community-based resources to keep matters out of the criminal legal system. If a matter must be addressed formally, the ADR subcommittee recommends the use of diversion opportunities beyond the current programs in place to ensure people are not being unnecessarily detained before adjudication of their charges, and to provide resources pending adjudication. Next slide, please. Mass criminalization is a significant cause of racial inequity throughout the United States. The focus should be placed on creating opportunities for people to avoid criminal records because of the collateral consequences not only to the person, but also the community. The ADR subcommittee recommends the county address systemic inequities by promoting and funding community-based programs engaged in alternative dispute modalities, or creating an independent agency outside of the criminal legal system for alternative processes. The subcommittee recognizes that there's no one-size-fits-all. All options should be made available, including but not limited to mediation, restitution, community service, and restorative justice. The ADR subcommittee recommends that non-judicial sanctions be provided to court-involved people for misdemeanor or other low-level offenses. Next slide, please. And finally, the ADR subcommittee recommends that the county implement performance measures to reform the legal system from entry to exit and provide public transparency in the use of community programs to implement these reforms. So there's a whole host of recommendations provided by ADR, and I would encourage that anyone interested review the report for those recommendations. And I turn it over to County Manager Schwartz.
Thank you, Devanshi.
Thank you.
You guys did a great job. One question which we've had experience in the county for at least just for a few months on having alternative docket for dispute resolution and diverting people with mental health issues. And I think that you talk a little bit about this, but there's one docket right now with the General District Court. Did you take a look at the potential of expanding that to other courts in the county?
We did, actually. We had Suzanne Somerville come and speak to us about the need for expanding those dockets to include, substance. We have a drug docket, but expanding that drug docket as well, and looking at different ways for us to be thinking about other issues. So where those needs are and analyzing what the cases are that are coming before our court system, we should be thinking about ways to adopt alternative dockets for addressing those specific matters in ways where we are not thinking about criminalization or punitive remedies as the primary focus of those dockets, but really providing services or resources as they may be necessary to ensure that people do not continue cycling through the system. I welcome the opportunity for Elizabeth and for Cicely to, and I don't know if Latasha's on here, but to add any additional thoughts as well.
Yeah, thank you so much. You did a fabulous job as always. I think the other piece too, along with what Devanshi's saying, is that we also want to expand, deepen what the different courts are doing, right? So for a drug court, if there's a way we can expand it to probation violations, that are much likely to result into someone continuing to get into a cycle of being with the court system, as opposed to just a new crime that's related to drugs. So I think there's lots of other ways that we can expand and deepen the work that we're doing for all of those. And so have elements like the mental health or like the drug court to be diversions rather than actually, as Devanshi was saying, actually connected specifically to punishment, punitive, that kind of stuff, which would be really ideal as well.
So Elizabeth or Devanshi, and I may be going way out of my depth here and is completely wrong, but do you know enough about how court funding is done at the state level? To the extent that there are diversions off the standard docket to these other kinds of cases, does that affect the amount of reimbursement that comes to local courts? Or am I just dreaming that there's somehow a little bit of a disincentive for us creating these dockets? Or you don't know what I'm talking about?
I'm not familiar, but maybe Devanshi, or I know Parissa's here.
Isn't funding your responsibility, Mark?
Okay, we'll put that one on pause, and we'll go to the people who know about it. This is a question, and you know, I think you all know me that sometimes I joke, but this is not a joke. This is a serious question, but it's not meant to cast aspersions on all of Arlington County or all our residents, because I think we live in a great community. But I know the group talked about it, which is that you have our call takers in ECC who I actually, and I know a lot of them, I think have been trained pretty well, but they absolutely need more training. How much and how long and how intensive do you think we need to train members of the community? And I mean that in its very broadest sense, to not reflexively I think it's been for 50 years, we've been told, see something, say something, pick up the phone, call 911. And I don't blame our community for acting reflexively, but isn't part of what you're talking about unlearning what is now a neural pathway?
No, that's exactly right. Right? It's been 40 years that we have done see something, say something, call 911. And, you know, we'll add to that, we are very fortunate that when we do call 911 here, somebody responds. We don't live in a community where there's no response. And so, you know, this is unlearning. And so when we talk about a public-private campaign, we are really looking at marrying the resources of the county and with the community and helping to undo this in situations where it's not appropriate. So we're addressing you need to really evaluate and think critically about why it is you believe something may be suspicious in nature, or why you're calling on a noise complaint, or whatever the situation might be. Really analyze what the genesis is for the thought or the feeling inside of you to pick up the phone and seek 911 assistance, especially when there could be other alternatives to calling 911. And what we have seen and what we have found is in our community, we don't necessarily know those resources very well. They're not, you know, laid out there very easily for our community to find and understand and implement in those times. And so the default ends up being 911. But to go to your question about how long do we need to do this, however long it takes for us to be able to accomplish the goal. And, you know, the DRE that the county worked on gives some really great information to us about the fact that at least 70% of those nearly 3,000 participants want to engage in these kinds of conversations and want to be able to think about ways that they can act in an anti-racist way, right? And so that curbs against the 57% that understand and believe that systemic racism exists here in Arlington County. So I think we have to keep doing it, but it's not always the county needs to be really supportive here around places where the community can really take the lead and help the people that it's connected to move into different spaces of anti-racism. I'm going to yield to Elizabeth and Cicely, who probably have so much to say, and you know, I'm going to sit back and learn some more.
Cicely, I'll turn it over to you because I spoke a second ago.
No, I think you hit it right on the head, Devanshi. And I think it is a continual learning process. And I don't think it will ever really stop. I think, especially as transient as Arlington is, we're always going to have to teach somebody, you know, the difference, the ways in which we go about doing things here in Arlington. So I think it's always going to be a learning process.
Yeah, and I think the other piece too is, you know, we like to think of like the work that we do specifically on anti-racism as there's like an actual item that's in motion, you know, like those conveyor belts. And so for you, in order to do anti-racism and pro-Blackness work, you literally have to turn around and walk against the conveyor belt. And so you have to turn around and walk faster if you actually want to be able to get anywhere. And so we really do see this as a marathon, not a sprint. So I agree both with, you know, Devanshi and Cicely. And I think the other piece that was really helpful within our committee or subgroup was that the folks at the actual call center really want the calls to go down, you know, and so that there is a buy-in there. And so I think that as Devanshi was saying, the partnership with the county and, and the community will make a huge difference. And if folks know that there's another number to call or that there's something else to do prior to 911, I think people are just innately going to want to do that, as long as they're being, knowing that they're doing the right thing.
Yeah. And real quick, Mark, it also will depend on, not just the ECC having the power to do such. It will also depend on those other departments being able to receive such and being able to have the training for those departments to be able to effectively, provide the support to the community.
So let me ask you a question. I don't know if you delved into this to the degree, but I know each of the three of you are very active given the work that you do, and what I call your free time, because your real time was spent on the subcommittee. But in your free time, how would you, given the opportunity, I know there are thousands of people listening in right now, leaving aside the ECC and call response, what would your advice be to people who are of good heart and of good mind, who want to learn more about how they can, if in a difficult situation, how they can get some skills? Because I'll be the first to tell you I'm one of those people, but I know each of your organizations do that. But how could they go about doing that rather than relying on the county to, quote, fix the problem for them? I know that's a profound but very tactical question. So start with you, Devanshi.
So, I mean, there's a lot of resources out there for people to be able to engage in, to address, to critically think about the way that they are addressing a specific matter. There's anti-racism training, anti-bias training. Sometimes I think that, in addition to going through such training, you got to also evaluate what's going on in your own life. Who are the people that are involved in your life? Are you able to expand that social circle to make sure that you have diversity in that circle, to be able to have honest and frank conversations about race, about racism, about systemic racism, and challenge your own thought processes? Because, quite frankly, trainings can only take you to a certain place, and sometimes training has that unintended effect of making people feel like, well, if I go through this training, I no longer have the issue. And I'm sorry, I think Cicely said, this is a lifelong process. We all have to go through this lifelong re-education, quite frankly, because systemic racism is what it is. It's pernicious. It invades all of our thinking, everything that we do, no matter who we are. So it's an ongoing re-education, and I think that you have to be critical about all aspects of your life.
And I want the least shy subcommittee to continue to offer comments. Cicely?
I like being shy on tonight. No, I would definitely piggyback off of what Devanshi said. It's hard to change what we've been doing for so long and what we have been, taught to do. And it's definitely going to be a challenge. So I think one of the things I always really kind of question people to do, or ask people to question themselves in, is if I see something, then why am I saying something? What is triggering in me to say something? And is it necessary that I call the police? Is a woman being beat on the street? Yes, I need to call the police. But is a random person walking, that doesn't quote unquote belong in my community? Do I really need to call the police for that? There's a retraining of our minds that we're going to have to do. And to be honest with you, I feel like Arlington is the place to do it. If we're going to be the progressive and community that we say we are, then we've got to really put our action with the words that we're saying.
Yeah, and I mean, I think, again, agree with everything that's being said. In addition to that is, what are what an honor and a privilege to live in this community where there are hundreds of resources out there, hundreds of nonprofits out there that do amazing work, and that we have, for many cases, access to Google, and that we can literally just search for all those things. And all of us in the nonprofit sector can support and have a great partnership with the county in that way. And so I do think that the information is out there. And what I'm hoping for is that community members will take the time to continue to do their own individual learning on becoming anti-racist and pro-Black themselves, but also to look around and see what other organizations and other individuals and other elements and resources in the community are doing that kind of work. And, your team, Mark, as well as other folks from the Department of Human Services and the county in general, because we have such a great partnership with our safety net nonprofits and, other nonprofits in the community, that you all are also a way to refer people over to us. And we, all of us want to say we're open for people to come in and have conversations with us and to really get to know why, the terms that we use isn't just, cultural competency and diversity training, but actually intentionally talking about pro-Blackness and anti-racism and liberation, and those kinds of things. And so we're open to, for folks to come out and chat with us. And we're looking forward to continue to be a great partner to the Arlington County folks.
Okay. I'm going to turn it back to you, Devanshi, for any final comments, and then you're going to turn it to Julie, and then she's going to turn it back to me. So we're going to go in a little bit of a circle here. But I trust you, Devanshi, to have that circle work well.
Oh, well, I mean, I think that, the goal of the ADR subgroup really is to be thinking about things beyond just the system and looking at root causes and not just addressing symptoms. So I encourage everyone to read the report as it pertains to the lens in which we focused. And thank you for your time. And I turn it over to Julie. Thank you.
You guys are great. This is such a challenging topic to try to figure out how to even manage to bring it into recommendations. You all did a great job. I also want to acknowledge, I think we said at the top and talked about all of the voting members of the group, but we also had 3 ex officio members of our group that really provided a lot of expertise and guidance through the process. So Patricia Taft from the prosecutor's office, the county prosecutor, Brian Stockton from Arlington County Schools, and the acting chief, Andy Penn, from the police department were all our ex officio members on this project, and their advice was really valuable to keep us moving. So, Mark, those are the recommendations from the 4 groups. You have the report, and really hope that the community will read the report and go through the slides, and really proud of the work that this group has done and the effort that they've put in over the last 6 months.
So thank you to you, Julie. I also want to thank Lynn Porphyry of my office, who has done absolute yeoman's job along with Bryna Helfer. And Jim Schwartz dabbled a bit before he decided to just retire because he couldn't handle it anymore. I'm just kidding about that last part. And we had a lot of assistance from county staff. So I really do appreciate that. What I wanted to do is just spend a minute or two and lay out what my approach is going to be. I literally just got, the report is actually, I think, dated February 15th because, and that's today. And so a lot of details, and it's been posted. So next, what's today, Monday? On Thursday of this week, I'm going to be previewing the fiscal 2022 budget. That meeting is going to be live streamed. And I know we're in a sort of challenging budget cycle, but I've gone out of my way as I've been listening to the conversations that have been held by the subcommittees to try to set aside some money to try to deal with some of the issues that have been raised here. So in my budget, I'll have proposals to try to address each of the sections here, but they are our proposals. They are still works in progress. For example, there'll be money set aside to deal with some of the mental health issues with the Civilian Review Board, with the traffic and the ADR subcommittees. There's funds set aside for each of those. I will tell you right now, I do not have the answer on the best approach to all of this. And since I haven't fully absorbed all the findings of the subcommittees and the full committee, I really welcome continued conversation on this. And it's been such a great group of people getting together, very positive. We have, if you take a step back and think for a minute, where we were when the group was formed on police practices and sort of the energy and time that's been spent on this. I do want to congratulate everybody involved who I think work closely with our police and also with our nonprofits and members of the community to make this a learning experience and to take it in the spirit in which I intended it, which was to not say to tear things apart, but to say what it is we have that works and how we can add to that. So there'll be a lot of proposals coming up, a lot of conversation, and I will be offering some recommendations. At the end of the day, the recommendations of this group have come to me, and I'll offer my thoughts on that. And everything will be acted upon in one form or another by the county board. So there'll be many additional opportunities for members of our community to comment on all the recommendations made here. I'm going to stop where I normally would say at this point that the group did such a good job that they need to stay in business for at least another year or two and hang out and just continue to meet and advise me. But I know I promised every member of the group, all 15 who have worked tirelessly, that this was going to be a 6-month effort. And so it was 7.5 months. So I kept a pretty good promise on that. More work following on issues related to our police department with Marcia Thompson and her report coming out, and there'll be more details on that coming up in the next week. So with that, I think I'm going to sign off for the evening. Thank everybody who took their time. And again, I'm so impressed with the commitment of everybody here and all the members, all the ex officio members, and all the people who participated. And I really am going to encourage you. The report is now going to be posted online. Take a look at it, and we look forward to having further conversations. And I think with that, I'm going to say good evening to everybody. Thank you very much.